Good afternoon, everyone. Why don't we go ahead and get started? Welcome to the Atlantic Council. My name is Damon Wilson. I'm the Executive Vice President here at the Atlantic Council, and I'm really pleased to welcome you all here for a conversation this evening about completing Europe and the future of Macedonia as part of Europe Whole and Free. I want to welcome you all here, but I'm particularly pleased to welcome one of our speakers today, Lord George Robertson. The Right Honorable Lord Robertson of Port Ellen, the former NATO Secretary General, and I'm proud to say my former boss at NATO headquarters. I am a biased moderator in this conversation, I will disclose right up front. Welcome to Washington. He's just off the plane to join us here, and we're really pleased to have him here for part of the conversation today. When we're gathering at what's a critical moment in Southeast Europe, in the Balkans, and Macedonia in particular, we've been watching a 27-year obstacle of the name issue for Macedonia, holding it beyond the reach of NATO and the EU. Some of us, including myself, were there in 2008 when we came close and thought that we would have a chance of being able to bring the country into the West and its institutions, but in many respects failed at that time, leading to a decade in which it was stuck on the outside and many ensuing political crises that we saw flow from that. Now we're meeting here in Washington in the wake of the controversial Prespa Agreement, in the wake of the NATO summit decision to begin the invitation talks, and the wake of the referendum, with an outcome that in many respects 90% voting yes, but under 40% turnout, and in the wake of a highly contentious parliamentary vote late Friday, Saturday. This is a difficult issue. It's a tough issue. It's an emotional issue for those for whom this is more than a policy or strategy issue. So we're going to unpack that today and have a conversation about the situation, about what it means for Macedonia, for the Balkans, and for U.S. and European Union strategy there. Lord Robertson is going to be joined by Lilica Kontanovska, who is the chief of the VOA Macedonian Service. Thank you for being with us, as well as Mike Carpenter, who is a senior director at the Penn Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement, as well as a senior fellow here and a longtime administration official at State, DOD, and the White House working on these issues. I'm also joined by my team, Sarah Bedenbaugh, who's been leading our work on the Balkans and Macedonia, as well as Graham Brookie, who's led our Digital Forensics Research Lab research into what's happening on the online platforms that we'll hear a little bit about. So with that, I want to turn this podium over to Lord Robertson. And I said already that I had an opportunity at the beginning of my career to work at NATO and to work for this man as his Deputy Chief of Staff, Deputy Director of the private office. And I joined his office in 2001. He was already NATO Secretary General at a time when tensions were brewing in Southeast Europe. In fact, when I joined, we were spending probably once a month in Macedonia, working to avert the country slipping further into what looked like inevitable expansion of a conflict in the former Yugoslavia. You were there regularly with the European Union, the OSCE, NATO, watching these three institutions come together to work with actors on the ground and the international community to prevent a war. It's a great diplomatic story, a painful chapter for Macedonia, but one for NATO in which you also oversaw one of the most remarkable, I think, NATO operations. First Essential Harvest, a NATO operation of 3,500 troops that disarmed rebels in Macedonia, and Amber Fox that followed that. Much of this was forgotten in the wake of 9/11 happening, but it was an extraordinary triumph of diplomacy and leadership despite the challenges today and still the implications we see today. Lord Robertson has gone on. He's now a senior counselor at the Cohen Group. We're delighted that they bring you to Washington so we get to see you here. For me, I'm privileged to have him as a member of the International Advisory Board of the Atlantic Council, a Knight of the Thistle bestowed by Her Majesty the Queen. He served as Secretary General of NATO from 1999 to 2004, came into that job after having served as Secretary of State for Defense under Prime Minister Blair from 1997 to 99 during the Kosovo Air Campaign, during operations in East Timor in Iraq. And this is someone who cut his teeth in local politics and politics in Scotland. He understands sense of identity and identity and nationalism as it relates to these issues, and has spent plenty of time in government, but also plenty of time in an opposition. And with that, I want to welcome you to the stage as someone who's been chairing something called the Ohrid Group, a group of international policymakers, former statesmen and women that have stood by Macedonia's European aspirations for years. Lord Robertson, please.
Thank you, Damon. In many ways, you've said pretty well everything I was going to say. And it's very good to be here. I know that people have come here because they're interested in the future of this country, this small country which burst into the headlines in 2001 in the worst possible way for a Balkan country, an insurgency in the north of the country, dividing lines which had been created by the previous constitution. And we had to do something about it. Luckily, the European Union and NATO at that time were cooperating. And we decided that unless we acted and acted swiftly, then this country would descend very quickly into that characteristic Balkans model of divided ethnic tribes fighting with each other, contesting each other, and a bloodbath was inevitably going to follow. So Javier Solana, then the High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy in the EU, Mircea Joana, who was the then Romanian Foreign Minister and the Chairman in Office of the OSCE, we all got together. We're down 11 times in Macedonia during that incredible year. And we were fortunate in as much as we had interlocutors in Macedonia who had the ability to see beyond the immediate conflict, to see beyond the rivalries that existed at that time, and who were willing to take risks, who were willing to be bold, who were willing to be incredibly courageous in the face of a lot of whipped up feelings around at that time. President Boris Tchaikovsky, among them the most senior, the most remarkable individual, who a Methodist, representing what a tiny 0.005% of the population, Methodist at that time, who took decisions and who stood firm in the face of a lot of emotions at that time, and took his country through to the Ohrid Agreement, to a deal that was done between all of the factions and a unity government that saved that country from the inevitable bloodshed that would have been created. And last month, with Damon, I had the great privilege of going back to the Tetovo Valley to the village of Tiarchi, which was one of the mixed villages that would have been the first victims of that interethnic conflict had it come to its logical Balkan conclusion, to see it living in harmony and now part of the progression of the of Eastern Europe. But we also went down to Bitola in the bottom of the country, close to the Greek border, where I addressed an outdoor meeting along with the quite remarkable mayor of Bitola, a woman who I would prophesy could stride the European continent, a star. I have rarely been caught by somebody so impressive there in making the case for the future, making the case for boldness and courage at this time. And that's what this process is about. People, all of us, in the outside world and inside the country, have got to look beyond immediate emotions of the moment, because what matters is going to be the future of the country. I met Mr. Tchaikovsky, the leader of the opposition. I told him, I'm an expert in opposition, sir. I was 18 years in opposition as a politician before we ever came back to power. And I know why we were in opposition, because we didn't put the national interest before the party interest. And that's the fate of politicians who play politics with the national interest as well. And I said to him he had to pay attention to the future of the country. Did he want his country to be called Fyrom forever? You know, that the decision that was going to be taken in the referendum will have the effect of wiping the word Fyrom from the maps of the world. And that's something that is worth doing. If you want to talk about national identity and you want to talk about national sovereignty, then the word Fyrom is a reduction of that. And we've got to think, all of us, outside and inside the country, about whether or not this country of Macedonia is going to be part of NATO, part of the European Union, part of the mainstream of Europe in a world today that needs countries that have got the tradition and the background and the 2001 courage that it had at that time. So that's why I was glad to be able to go down, not to tell people how to vote, but to tell people what the outside world cared about. The Ohrid group included Javier Solana, Wolfgang Ischinger, the former Prime Minister of Sweden, you know, the former Private Secretary to Her Majesty the Queen in the United Kingdom. People who have all got a background in that region, who were all involved at the time and who cared about the future as well. So the decision that was taken in the Parliament last Friday reminded me of a vote in the British Parliament in 1972 when some 30 Labour MPs broke the Labour whip in order to vote for the entry of Britain into then European Economic Community. They did so because they put the national interest before the party interest at that time. One of them became, John Smith became the leader of the Labour Party and never suffered. Roy Jenkins and other key people as a consequence of that. And we never regretted it. We regret very much where the country is at the present moment, and Macedonia can look forward to European Union membership just as the United Kingdom decides to get out of it from the back door. But you know, this is a time where people need to look to the future, look to the national interest, look broader and wider, and remember the courage and boldness of the politicians of Macedonia in 2001 who saved their country. Saved their country. They did that in boldness, with boldness and courage. I hope that politicians today in Macedonia think along the same lines. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lord Robertson. I'm going to invite the panelists to come up to the podium, including you, sir. Please take the stage.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for those remarks, sir. I want to encourage everybody who's in this room, but also those that are following online, to use our hashtag #BalkansForward as you want to join the conversation, put in your own ideas. I also want to encourage, if there are any backbenchers, you're welcome now to come forward, to take the front seat, to take some seats along the side so that you can be seated here. Let me start with a follow-up question, Lord Robertson, and I'll bring in Lilica and Mike into this. This is a tough issue for those from Macedonia, and we've seen, obviously, a referendum that produced over 90% support for it, and yet under 40% turning out. We've seen a pretty strong effort that was behind a boycott movement. Here in the United States, a lot of the diaspora has been pretty clear on this point as well, concerned about what this means. How, on such a momentous decision, does Macedonia maintain sort of a strategic way forward of anchoring itself in the West, in Europe, when it is very divided politically at home? You've been through very divisive political debates in the UK. We've watched that here. And on an issue of such importance for the future of the country, how do you stitch together a consensus that's durable and not just subject to the whims of being turned back with the next election?
Well, it won't be easy, but then nothing of value ever is easy. In 2001, the emotions were running high, as you and I well remember. We used to sit in President Tchaikovsky's office, and rocks were being thrown against the shutters as we had the meeting. Sometimes it was difficult to speak. We had the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, we had the EU representatives there, we had other people in the room. Emotions were running high, but they didn't necessarily represent the national interest as a whole. And I think when the decisions are taken, things will settle down. I think people will realize that some of the more extreme positions that have been taken up at the present moment have more to do with emotion than with rationality. I don't know why anybody would want to keep the name firearm, because that is what certainly the short-term consequence would be of rejecting the agreed formula with Greece. That seems to me to be a condemnation of insignificance. And the offer of NATO membership and then the prospect of European Union membership means that Macedonia ceases to be a backwater, to be ignored and to have this confusion about the name as a permanent thing. So I think I can see that people will eventually begin to recognize that that is the case.
At a time of ambivalence in Western capitals about the future of enlargement, it's pretty interesting that we're talking about enlargement. How durable do you think both the NATO commitment is and the EU prospect of accession, given the political appetite, whether it's President Trump's remarks on the Montenegro as a new ally or President Macron's ambivalence about further expansion? The other end of the deal here is the pathway this opens for Macedonia, and how durable, credible is that commitment from the ambivalent political leaders in the West?
Well, it'll be up to leaders in Macedonia to make the case. They can't do it at the moment because they're not even allowed to call themselves by their own name, whereas, you know, if the name changes and the agreement is endorsed, then they become part of the mainstream of Europe and they get over the obstacle that has always prevented them from being a force in the argument that needs to take place. And in many ways, because a lot of European leaders have been to Macedonia, have been to Skopje, who have made the case and made the argument, they've actually brought alive the whole question about enlargement and how that strengthens Europe as a whole. So I think that this process has actually gained a great deal of attention. In this case, for the right reasons. You know, we gained it in 2001. I remember when we decided to put in the NATO force at that time in order to disarm the rebels, in order to take their weapons back. There was an article written in the London Times with a strapline saying, "Lord Robertson will not be content until the Balkans are aflame from the Adriatic to Istanbul." Now, I know that journalist today still. I said, hang on a minute, would you like to apologise for what you wrote at the time? But that was one of the perceptions of Macedonia then. So it was publicity for the wrong reason, whereas now people are now saying, you know, take that step forward now, and the prospects are there. They can't go back on that.
So Lilith, let me bring you into this. You've been covering politics in the country and the region for years. Just bring us up a little bit from your perspective on where we are, how we actually got here, and where we're going. Not the sort of the more tactical blow right now as you follow the news cycle.
Where do you want me to start? Today, yesterday, Friday?
How did we get to the vote? How did we get to the vote, the dramatic vote in the parliament, and what comes next?
Absolutely. Yes, we were covering Macedonia day in and day out, and since Friday, I wouldn't go even further than that. It was changing situation by the hour. We were following the vote and counting and all that, so it's all old news. Today is a new story. I'm glad they got it out of the way, so now we can think what is the next step. Today, just as we speak here, the biggest opposition party of Amaro is holding their meeting on the highest level, deciding where they're going to go. Obviously, the strategy that they were pursuing was not working. And it came to that we're going to see dramatic changes or shake-up or something like that. But also, there is another thing that I think should be taken into account, the inside factor. Now, I call it Albanian factor, but there are Albanian parties that are involved in this, some with the government, some outside the government. So what is the importance of that is how they're going to vote. Elections are coming up, and they're all positioning themselves, so that will be another thing to watch. But the good thing is that Macedonia and this leadership has a very strong, I would say, 3 strong pillars of support. United States being one, and that has been great. Just today, we know that Matthew Palmer was there, the Deputy Assistant Secretary, was visiting, voicing support for Macedonian leadership and the way it's going. He didn't meet, however, with the president, neither with the opposition leadership. Is there a message? I don't know. He was asked, actually, at the press conference, and he said, no, it was just short in time or whatever. But people read into that a lot. So another one would be Brussels. Brussels was always with Macedonia, backing Macedonian leadership on the way toward integration to the European Union. And people think that Merkel, Chancellor Merkel, is a great supporter, and they think it's the engine of Europe these days. So that's all good in terms of where the country is going. If there are checks and balances, then it's a definite check forward. You know, we are going toward something that is bigger and better. And I'm a journalist, and I have to refrain from voicing judgments or anything, but I still think that it's good what Lord Robertson also mentioned. Some people stepped forward away from the party interests in the interest of the country. So that was the greatest thing that happened on Friday. However, not everybody is happy, and probably we have some people who will voice different opinions here. It is, it's going to be challenging time for many of them.
And Lilica, can you also lay out what procedurally, how does this unfold? What comes next? Because this was actually just the first vote.
Yeah, I'm a journalist, but also I'm a lawyer. So the lawyer in me always thinks about how much time do you need for this move or the other one. First, they have to let the government submit the proposal, the draft. Actually, the proposal was out. The first phase is done. So the draft of the amendments. However, they have up to 30 days. The Prime Minister promised that it's going to be 10 days or maybe less. So I would put it within the next week. The proposals will be, the draft amendments will be submitted. After that, there is a debate. For each of the amendments, there are like 3 days for each. Let's assume there will be 3 or 4 amendments. So they're going to discuss that, and that's simple majority they need for them to pass. But then the Parliament has to open the public debate, which means first going through the Commission. It's a committee, the legislation, the Parliament Commission, and then the full Parliament will have to vote on that. After the government submits the report of the debate. I would say that the whole thing is doable in 60 days. And I think that's what the leadership is aiming at this moment. I even have a date. My sources are telling me that they're playing with December 23rd, maybe. Or the worst case scenario, plan B, would be sometime immediately, actually, after New Year's. So Christmas is not big there, but New Year's it is. So.
Threat of the snap election for the time being.
Yes, that was, I think, the greatest benefit from Friday's vote. So there is no early elections, which takes the focus from that. It relieves that pressure, and now they can focus on working on this process.
Mike, let me bring you into this from a broader strategic perspective. Why, given the number of issues that we are paying attention to managing here in Washington, and certainly that the administration is grappling with, why is there an effort, attention focused on Macedonia? What are the stakes, the interests for the United States in all of this?
I think the stakes, Damon, are enormous and go far beyond simply Macedonia and the country itself and its roughly 2 million inhabitants and its location in the Balkans. I think what we're talking about here is a geopolitical competition of systems, really. One way to look at the choice that Macedonians have before them is a choice of Euro-Atlantic integration, becoming part of structures that are effectively Western structures that will embed Macedonia within those rule of law constraints and other Article 5 guarantees, security benefits that accrue with belonging to these structures on the one hand. And on the other hand, frankly, stagnation, a possible return of a kleptocratic system, manipulation by outside powers, of which the most important is Russia, but certainly there are others who also play in the Balkans. And so I think when you look at this, the possibilities that stand currently before Macedonians, it is really a choice between, from the way I see it, a more secure, prosperous, stable future with a trajectory towards Europe, the EU and NATO on the one hand, and a very unsettled future with the prospect, and this is what Lord Robertson alluded to, with the prospect of ethnic grievances coming into play. And, you know, this may sound overly dramatic, but really potentially even the unraveling of the Ohrid Agreement, because if you look at some of the rhetoric that has been deployed and some of the propaganda and disinformation that has been marshaled in this debate, there are accusations against the ethnic Albanian minority that it is acting and voting in its own interests and forsaking the Macedonian national interest. And that is very dangerous, because then again, that sort of stokes that ethno-nationalism, which in the Balkans is a recipe for disaster. And I hope that we leave that behind and instead we focus on the positives that that stand before us now as a result of this vote, and potentially another vote in January
so this
or
could,
in December.
This could all still fall apart. We've seen Macedonia at many steps over the past 3 years, if not 27 years, when it's been on an edge. It's been a very difficult, obviously, decision, and it's clearly not a unified population around this. What happens? What is the alternative if this does fall apart as it unfolds through the next parliamentary votes?
My view is this is the decision of a generation. I don't think there will be another chance at this, another bite at this apple for another generation, meaning 20, 30 years. I've spoken with so many members of the Macedonian diaspora and sympathized with them when I was in the Pentagon about how many membership action plan cycles Macedonia was waiting to get to an invitation to join NATO. You know, they had passed 18 cycles, and there were jokes going around, well, by now, Membership Action Plan is an adult in Macedonia. It's been around 18 years. When is this finally going to happen? But all kidding aside, what this stagnation did was it really dimmed the belief among Macedonians in their own future, in the possibility of NATO membership, and the possibility that the EU would also open its doors. And that opened up, I think, room for ethnic politicking, for kleptocratic interests to come in, and for outside powers to to manipulate and to try to sow dissensus, as we've seen them do in this country and in other West European societies as well. And so that's what I think this boils down to.
So, Lord Robertson, you've also spent a lot of time with the Greeks, whether around the North Atlantic Council table or whether in Athens itself. You've chaired plenty of summit meetings with Greek leaders. Is there not an alternative? Can you imagine a pathway where you could have reached an agreement with Greece that wouldn't have required this type of name change? How do you see the Greek equation factor into this outcome?
There's a debate going on in Greece at the present moment, and there's a likelihood there that it might be vetoed on the Greek side, never mind on the Macedonian side. Because these ethnic nationalisms are about identity politics. Is the sort of the name of the game. The issues have gone global, but the politics have gone local. But yet again, I don't see that they have an alternative. Those who argue in Macedonia against the agreement and those in Greece who argue against the agreement don't have an alternative to it. And I don't see any early signs that there would be another Greek government or another Greek leadership that would have some new ingenious idea that would actually be able to resolve the issue. We're at this moment in time, as Mike said, it's a generational point here that the decision can be taken. The conjunction of Prime Minister Zaev and Prime Minister Tsipras coming together, finding an accommodation, is an alignment of the stars that is unlikely to happen for another 30 or 40 years. And therefore, you have to ask those on either side who object to it to say what is their alternative. At the moment, the Greeks will accept the name Former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. And in many ways, that is almost a bigger acceptance of the name Macedonia than North Macedonia. So there is an illogicality here, an irrationality here, that is being resolved because two far-sighted leaders have said, let's resolve this in the interests of all of us and in the wider interests of the region as a whole. And, the alternative is stagnation. It's being outside of the loop, and that has dramatic consequences for the economy and for the economic future of the country. You and I saw that countries who were accepted into NATO membership automatically moved their investment grade status internationally in the banking world, and economically they had an advantage. It's strange that a defence alliance would have that effect, but it does. And the opposite would apply, I fear.
I think that was one of the things that struck me in our most recent visit. I believe it was at Tearchi, where the town reportedly had about 4,000 residents, and there were about 350 actually living there. Yeah. It struck me that one of the fundamental issues is where is the pathway for young Macedonians to pursue their families and careers in Macedonia. I found that striking on our
there were more voters in Britain and in America from that village than there actually were in Macedonia. So because people have gone, they said, oh, that house is, they live in Birmingham. We met the lady from Michigan who was a great supporter of Donald Trump.
We met a lot of Trump voters in rural Macedonia.
A Trump voter in Macedonia. There you go.
Well, let me pick up on a theme for all of you that you've touched on in various ways. Mike, you mentioned the issue of outside influence. Clearly, there's an authentic disagreement on this core issue. Yet we've watched, and there's been an issue of outside influence in the Balkans throughout the region. We saw Greece actually earlier this year expel two Russian diplomats for getting involved, particularly in this issue. How have you seen the involvement of outside actors in Macedonia in particular from your reporting, Lilica, and you've written about this extensively, Mike. Let me ask you two about this as well.
You're asking about fake news. Macedonia is a pro there, the capital of fake news. No, I've heard these couple of days a lot of things that were not true. At least I cannot believe that is true. And we were talking with Anna today before we came here. In the Greek media, it was all over the place how Macedonian leadership bought the votes. That cannot be true, and I don't want to believe that it's true. And what kind of what kind of influence it's going to have? I don't think it will have any, because people are very aware where they want to be, where they want to go. Young people, especially what you were just talking about, instead of leaving the country, they would like to be treated well in their own country and to have the same respect that their peers do. They want to be recognized, and I think there is no turning back. No, you know, it's kind of a will of history is pushing forward, no matter what. There are obstacles. You know, you can put something in, it can stall for a while, but it is going forward, and I think there is no way backwards from here.
Let me ask you to focus in on what you've written about extensively, the role of outside powers in the Balkans and Russians in particular, and how has that been a factor or not in some of what you've seen in Macedonia and more broadly Greece?
Well, I think in Macedonia we have seen extensive Russian involvement in fomenting disinformation, but also in trying to bring people out in the streets. As we looked at some of the, and your team here has also looked at this, so we looked at the online disinformation that is so characteristic of, for example, Russia's interference here in the United States. In Macedonia, it was somewhat attenuated, I would say. Macedonians, from what I understand, are not particularly avid Twitter users, for example. So whatever was happening on Twitter, and there was some evidence that there was interference on Twitter, but it was marginal. It was probably not great. But where the Russians were very active is in terms of using oligarchs in the region, and they have been named, folks like Ivan Savidis in Thessaloniki, to fund protests in the streets in opposition to the name agreement, both in Greece and in Macedonia. And so you had the Greek government expelling those two diplomats, let's call them for what they were spies, who were paying off individuals in the Orthodox Church, military veterans, ultra-nationalist groups to come out against the name agreement in Greece, and then mirroring that on the Macedonian side of the border and stoking protests by paying off, again, nationalist groups and some politicians who had forged ties to the Russian regime. And this is very insidious because, again, Russia sees this as a backyard in which it can play, sees this as a geopolitical competition, very much wants to prevent Macedonia from moving forward with EU and NATO membership. And so we've seen a tremendous amount of interference. And this is not to discredit those Macedonians who oppose the name agreement, just as it's not to discredit those Americans who voted for Donald Trump in the last election. But we must acknowledge that, nevertheless, despite that, Russia was very active in supporting those two causes in our last election, and then also opposition to the name agreement, to the Prespa Agreement. In Macedonia, and really using sort of the tools at its disposal. So not so much cyber in this case, but very much using channels of covert financing via local oligarchs and politicians in both countries that are sympathetic to Russia.
I want to begin to bring folks into the conversation, but Mike referred to the work of Graham Brookie and our Digital Forensics Research Lab. So I'd like to put Graham on the spot. Yes, I'd like to put Graham on the spot. If you could share, Graham's not a Macedonia expert, he's a digital forensics expert whose team monitored the election along with what you do for elections throughout the world. Can you just share with us a little bit of your highlight takeaways from your findings?
I would be happy to. So first and foremost, I agree with everything that Mike just said. I think that was a very careful and accurate statement, which is absolutely necessary when we're talking about disinformation. So what the Digital Forensic Research Lab here does is identify, expose, and explain disinformation. In the context of Macedonia, two things are extremely important. One is the way information spreads and is consumed in Macedonia, which is to say, as Mike pointed out, there's not a lot of Twitter users in Macedonia. So if there are false positives, that could be one very specific one. The media market for Macedonia is mostly broadcast news in the evening. Outside of that, there's a fragmented media market that includes a number of online news outlets, which makes Facebook, where those news articles are shared, more vulnerable to coordinated disinformation. That's point one. Point two, the one-sided nature of the campaign made it very interesting to track disinformation in Macedonia, in the sense that there was one named campaign in favor of a yes vote. There was not necessarily a coordinated campaign no, it was boycott, and it was mostly anonymous. So that made it more difficult to track. The three categories of disinformation that we saw in Macedonia that I would point out would include inauthentic disinformation, coordinated disinformation, and then the question that we get asked quite often, which is, was there foreign influence? In terms of inauthentic behavior, we saw it. We saw a little bit. It was not at scale, and it did not move the marker in the vote. An example of that would be during Facebook Lives, there was a coordinated campaign where the Prime Minister went all across the country, and he put it on Facebook Live. The engagement on those Facebook Live videos, in some certain circumstances, included angry emojis that were only promoted by Vietnamese users, which should tell you something. We didn't see a massive amount of traction from or interest from Vietnamese nationals in the Macedonian naming referendum. What that indicates is higher likes or dislikes, in this case, on Facebook. That's inauthentic behavior. And it's out of bounds for Facebook. It's out of bounds in terms of foreign influence. It's pretty easy to point out. The second is coordinated activity. And the most useful example of that, I would say, would be a number of memes that we saw spread online by organic users, meaning real users, provably real people using specific accounts rather than a number of accounts at once. And they were spreading Nazi memes. Everybody that is telling you to vote yes is a Nazi. This is fascist and it's from the West, and that's coordinated behavior. But it doesn't mean that real people aren't spreading that. It might be disinformation, but it's coordinated and authentic behavior on social media, which makes it harder to measure. And then the third question is foreign influence. And as Mike pointed out, covert influence operations on social media are going to have diminishing returns if you have overt influence in the country already. So online operations that were attributable to Russia is a question that we get quite often. In Macedonia, we did not see that at scale. That doesn't mean that influence operations aren't ongoing with things like augmented embassy staff as opposed to troll farms on Twitter, which would be not as effective because Twitter is not used in Macedonia.
Thank you very much, Graham. I want to continue to bring in folks. I might turn also to Ambassador Vershbow, if I might, as someone who is both former Deputy Secretary General of NATO, former ambassador to Russia, and has a fair amount of personal skin in the game of having worked this as well, for a couple of your comments and questions, and others can catch my eye, please.
Well, it's an unexpected honor, and great to see also a former boss, Lord Robertson. I was ambassador until 2001, just before this whole thing blew up. But I just wanted to stress the sort of, given that there may still be many twists and turns in this saga, despite the good news from Friday night, that this really is a generational opportunity. I think my experience dealing with this issue in Washington, in Brussels, on several assignments, is that this is the last chance for a generation. So I hope that with this positive shift on the part of at least a few individuals that put the vote over the top, that the momentum will be generated, and that this will also have a positive knock-on effect on the debate inside Greece. Because it really would be, as you said, in describing this event, completing Europe and thwarting Russian efforts to further destabilize and divide the continent. So the stakes are high for us, but of course the stakes are highest for the people of Macedonia. And I just hope that this momentum really begins to build from here.
Thank you, Sandy. I want to turn to Meto of the United Macedonian Diaspora. Meto, you've been outspoken on this issue from another perspective.
Yes,
so I invite you to share,
well,
share your views.
My perspective comes from a human rights right to self-determination. The name former Yugoslav Republic is actually a reference, and if we didn't like it, Lord Robertson, who comes from Scotland and knows a lot of this history of Scotland versus Britain, and very similar to perhaps history between Macedonia and Greece, we should have used the reference at that time when we were Secretary General of NATO, and perhaps we could have helped resolve this issue a lot sooner. I remember Rumsfeld going to Macedonia and saying, pass the Ohrid Framework Agreement and you're going to get into NATO. It gets passed, and now it's passed the Prespa Agreement, which is another lake, by the way, and so who knows what the next agreement after the third lake will be. However, pass this agreement, Prespa, and you will get into NATO. So I want to know, what are the guarantees that if Macedonia implements all of the necessary things on the agreement, and let's say the Greeks do not deliver on their end of the bargain, what are we all prepared to do? So that's question number one. The other one is related to Russia, perhaps nationalism and all that. Does somebody who fights for human rights and right to self-determination, particularly in a country in the United States which recognizes the country as Republic of Macedonia, are they a nationalist? Are they pro-Russian? And then third, on Friday's vote, several of the MPs that voted from the Vamoro party are allegedly responsible for crime and corruption, misuse of funds. One of them was a former Minister of Culture that spent 750 million euros in the Skopje 2014 project. And so perhaps there wasn't a bribe, maybe there was a bribe, but why would somebody that built up Alexander the Great statues throughout the country and renaming highways then vote for an agreement that goes against her own party? And so the question is, what is the separation of executive and judicial powers? And then in terms of EU, France, Netherlands, and Denmark are blocking Macedonia's date for accession talks because of rule of law issues, because of corruption and that kind of stuff. So what are we going to hold Macedonia accountable to make sure that they're meeting rule of law and all that as they progress down the path?
Terrific. Let me turn to the panel to pick up on a couple of those pieces, then I'll take a question in the back of the room. But I think that's important. What happens if the Greeks actually back out of their end of the bargain? Is being a nationalist equated to being pro-Russian? I think Mike addressed that, but I think that's an important point, and these other points as well. So let me invite you to pick up on some elements of that.
Well, I'm happy to jump in on the first one. You know, I was frankly surprised myself at the NATO summit that Macedonia got such an unconditional offer of entry into NATO once it got past the hurdle with the name agreement. I was actually expecting something more akin to what Montenegro got at the Wales summit in 2014, which was, you're making a lot of progress, but you still have a lot of rule of law issues to work through. Once you've made progress on, and here are some specific homework assignments, once that's done, foreign ministers can take up the issue of NATO membership for Macedonia. That didn't happen. Instead, the summit communique very clearly states that Macedonia will become a member of NATO. So I think this is as good a deal as it gets. Of course, the Greeks could back out. You now see that Kamenos, the defense minister in Greece, has been vocally against the agreement and what that means for the coalition there. Of course, New Democracy has been very opposed from the get-go. So this is tenuous in Greece, and we should recognize that. I frankly don't know. I don't know what sort of leverage the other members of NATO will apply to Greece, to the Tsipras government in particular, if this fails to receive backing from the population there at the end of the day. But I would hope that NATO allies would stick together and would apply leverage and pressure. And you know, Greece is in an interesting situation right now geopolitically. I think they look to NATO a lot more than maybe they did 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. So remains to be seen, but I think this is really as good as it gets, and if this agreement is ratified by both sides, NATO membership for Macedonia is a done deal. I'll let the other panelists address, some of the other issues, but just real quick on pro-Russian. Of course not. Look, it's understandable. It's eminently reasonable for the population of a country to resent the fact that another country is demanding they tack on an adjective to their country's name. I understand that, but the issue here is about being pragmatic and moving forward. And as Lord Robertson said, FYROM versus North Macedonia. Frankly, I'd rather have North Macedonia. People like me will still call you Macedonians. We'll still refer to the country as Macedonia. That's maybe not diplomatic to say, but it's true. And so it's about being pragmatic, getting over this hump, and locking in the country into Euro-Atlantic structures.
I may. We do not know what's going to happen in Greece. Of course, the deal requires ratification from Greece, and this could topple the coalition government in Athens, as Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras' junior partner, the right-wing independent Greeks, strongly opposes the deal, saying that it concedes too much to Macedonians. Half of the Macedonians think that there was too much conceding to Greece. But I would say that I really believe that the agreement is likely to go through, as although Greek Foreign Minister Nikos Koutsias has resigned, it came at the time of growing instability in Greece governing coalition, and some argue that the anger over the name agreement has provided Greece's previously embattled far right with an opportunity to catapult itself out there into the mainstream political conversation, and this kind of outcome will actually put that issue to rest and take that opportunity from the far right. So that's my 5 cents on this.
Would you like to add anything to that?
The fact is that unanimity is the principle in NATO. So there can be no NATO membership for Macedonia if Greece does not agree. That's one of the realities. You cannot join. You cannot be expelled other than the principle of unanimity, and that is not going to change. So the answer is if they walk away from it, or if Macedonia walks away from it, then the prospect is not there. As Sandy Vershba said. This is the chance. This is the chance. And, for those who object and those who have got complaints about it, and we spent nearly 3/4 of an hour with Mr. Mikovsky going over some of the grievances that he had. The biggest issue is there. And in 2001, it would have been easy, for President Tchaikovsky to bend according to the winds that were blowing at that time. But the country as a whole decided that it was going to step away from the precipice. And, I hope that it does exactly the same again here. You mentioned my nationality. Well, I'm Scottish, and I'm British, and I'm European. In the referendum campaign that we had, where nobody tried to boycott, where a turnout was at record levels, nearly 90%, the people of Scotland decided they wanted to be part of the United Kingdom, to remain part of the United Kingdom. So it's quite possible to have your identity and have your national identity, inside something that is imperfect. And that's what it is. I'm a very, very proud, and patriotic Scot. I'm not a nationalist and I'm not a separatist, but I'm absolutely a Scot first, then British, then European. So, I think that is something that will happen in Macedonia after it happens. You notice at all of my time I called it Macedonia. I call it Macedonia. But the formal title is the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, FYROM, and that's what's on the maps. That's on the navigation maps, the aerial navigation maps, and the official maps of the world. And we want to get rid of that. And this seems to me to be the opportunity when it can be done.
I'd like to pick, I'd like to pick up I think this gentleman here, and then I had two women over here, so please, and use the mic. And
We better be brief.
I'm Barry Wood. I write about Eastern Europe.
Questions so we can pick up a couple.
I think Ms. Gitanovska's argument is persuasive. There's no going back. But I'd like to put a scenario and see what the panel thinks of it. I think NATO is going to happen for Macedonia, and I think the deal obviously goes through. But you remember back to 2003-04 when the European Union was expanding. They talked about a little caravan or a big caravan, or a flotilla. It seems to me that the European Union is not going to move forward on expansion, and if they do, it's going to be a big flotilla, and therefore, unless there's some real change, nothing is going to happen.
So your question, not NATO.
In terms of EU
yes,
membership.
Yes, NATO, but not EU. Let me turn to this woman here, please. And I'm going to pick up as many as I can, so please just ask a question. Thank you.
Okay. Just wanted to introduce myself as member of a relatively new organization of diaspora called Forum for Democratic Macedonia. So I would like to use this opportunity to tell you that the diaspora is not monolithic, that there are many, many Macedonians living outside the country who have very diverse opinions regarding this issue, that not all of the diaspora boycotted the name change initiative, and that many of us support the referendum and continue to support all of the actions that are being undertaken currently in Macedonia towards integration into NATO and EU. Obviously, Macedonia is in a super vulnerable position. The country is essentially incapable at this moment of establishing rule of law, especially after 11 years of governance by a party, dominated by a party that used ethno-nationalist rhetoric to create a degree of polarization that we haven't seen since the independence. So my point is only, yes, I just want to say this. No, just a statement rather than a question. The statement is that we find ourselves at a very difficult threshold at the moment. Nothing will happen fast there in terms of decisions. So what kind of support can we expect down the road from the international community to help us as we try to negotiate this very difficult path forward? What is the most realistic kind of support we can expect?
Thank you.
That's the question.
That question. I want to focus on questions, not statements, and we'll pick up one here, please. If the mic's over here.
Thank you. Sorry.
This gentleman here. Sorry, I know there are a lot of hands. I'm trying my best. Please. This gentleman. Nope. This gentleman right here.
Hi, Petros Kasfikis from Athens News Agency. Just a few hours ago, the Russian foreign minister accused the United States for meddling in the recent parliament vote. And also, we see the opposition in Fyrom, some part, corroborating this accusation. Do you believe that these accusations should be examined?
All right, Russian accusation of U.S. meddling. What kind of support can Macedonia expect from the international community after it's through this process? And NATO looks viable, but the EU looks really difficult. Start with you, Mike.
Sure. So let me consolidate the first two, the question and the statement from over here about the EU and rule of law. In many ways, the decision before Macedonians, and forgive me, but this is the way I see it, is between the future and the past. It's between institutions that will safeguard rule of law, remove impediments to trade and borders, and integrate Macedonia within the Balkans, hopefully foster regional reconciliation across the broader region, and ease links with people-to-people links with Europe. That's one scenario. That's the future. The past is the past. It's turmoil in the Balkans. It's unfortunately unconsolidated rule of law, weak institutions, stagnation, political gridlock. What we understand the region has produced a lot of, a surfeit of, frankly, over the last couple decades. And so I think that once Macedonia is in NATO, I think the EU will take time, for sure. It'll take a long time. But you've got countries like Montenegro, Serbia that are striving to reach EU membership, Albania, and all of that is going to take time to be processed. But the incentive structure that the EU lays out is one of consolidation of rule of law. And so I think even if it takes a decade, it is still progress. It is still consolidating rule of law, the fight against organized crime, countering corruption, and hopefully a more inclusive sort of political culture as well, where various different parties, like as is the case now in Macedonia, parties representing Turks and Roma and Albanians and ethnic Slavic Macedonians can all come together and form a government. So that's how I see those two things. In terms of, I saw the accusations that were made by the Russian Foreign Ministry about U.S. meddling in the vote in the Macedonian parliament, and I like their evidentiary standard, which is that the U.S. ambassador was present in the parliament. Therefore, there must have been U.S. meddling, and in fact, he orchestrated this entire vote himself personally. Look, the Russians do disinformation. Sometimes they do it well. In this case, they're doing it rather poorly.
I would just say that I totally agree that as much as NATO is reachable in the near future, I think that's going to happen really soon. European Union should wait for Macedonia a little bit. I mean, there is a lot of work ahead for this leadership, for the people in Macedonia to work on. There are several big spheres that Macedonians really have to tighten up their legislature, their laws, their standards. So that will take some time. As for Russian meddling, I actually saw a raised hand there. We have at VOA somebody who is really trained to figure out what is fake, what is true, what is false, and you already called him, so he will probably talk more about that because he was doing research on that.
I just say that there's nothing guaranteed. The European Union is going through an evolution itself. It's obsessed at the moment with certain domestic issues inside the Eurozone, with the exit of the United Kingdom, but the future is there to be made. You know, 6 years ago, if you had predicted that President Trump would be the President of the United States of America, that Mr. Macron, coming from nowhere, would be the President of France, that Mr. Trudeau, coming from nowhere in Canadian politics, would be the Prime Minister of Canada, that Mrs. May would be the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, that President Zuma would have left office involuntarily, and that President Mugabe would have been displaced as the President of Zimbabwe. If you'd said that on an Atlantic Council platform 6 years ago, you would have been certified. So we don't know what the next 6 years is going to produce. The European Union is evolving, Europe is evolving, and Macedonia needs to be in there. It needs to be in there if it's going to be part of the future game that is played inside Europe as a whole. And that's why it's so important that this logjam is broken, and the people of Macedonia, who showed such boldness and radical courage in 2001, get the opportunity to make their own future. And that's what it's about. It's not about guarantees from anybody else. And the lady over there is right. It is super vulnerable as a little tiny nation, obscure because nobody knows what its actual name really is, or part of a country that is recognized now. The support that was given by all of these leaders who went to Macedonia in the run-up to this referendum are not going to forget it. It's now back on the map, and for the very best of reasons, and it can now make its own future, and that's what it should be about.
We're getting close to the witching hour. I'm going to close out with these two comments here, questions here for this gentleman and this woman here.
Boris Kamchev, polygraph.info. Lilica, thank you very much for the kind words. I just have one question. We know that Russian influence is wide-ranging, and they are issuing statements about developments in Macedonia. Recently, there was a statement a hint that Russia might use its veto power as a permanent member of the Security Council. Yeah, and what did you take into consideration this, and what influence, how it would impact the Macedonian membership into NATO if Russia really asserts its veto power in the Security Council?
Yeah. Angle. And let me ask for a question, not a long comment, please, as we wrap up.
Thank you. I'd like to address the fact that we have so many gentlemen here from a very important organization that was founded on some principles, and those included human rights and democracy and spreading good values that we believe in. And I'd like to bring up Article 8 of the agreement that the Macedonians were pressured into agreeing with. And this article basically states that there will be a commission that will have the right to revise the textbooks and the maps and other auxiliary materials in the schools of Macedonia, in the history books. I'd like to remind you that Raphael Lemkin, who coined the word genocide and who actually drafted the first genocide convention, spoke to the cultural aspects of the crime of genocide. And one of the first things that he talked about was the way that the language and the culture are disintegrated of a people. That genocide was not necessarily the physical act of the crime. So I'd like to ask you gentlemen here who are leading organizations that are supposed to be the gatekeepers of freedom and democracy, why is it that after 66% of the Macedonians did not come out to vote, so obviously did not agree with this kind of pressure, even though they could have been for NATO and EU, why is it that they were, in the end, pressured to agree with this? And isn't there another alternative? And second question, any person who is in diplomacy these days knows that any sustainable long-term solution to a conflict must address and recognize the root causes of that conflict. And the root causes of the conflict between Macedonia and Greece are the 100-year denial of the ethnic identity and language of the Macedonians in Greece, which with this agreement were not recognized. And not only were they not recognized, but this agreement actually denies the ethnic identity and language of the Macedonians in Macedonia. So could you please address another way to resolve this issue in the future?
Thank you. So the UN Security Council angle, and is there an alternative, essentially, as you lay out? Let me use this as that will be the last set of questions here, and I'll come back. Let me conclude with you, Lord Robertson, and ask Mike Lilitz any brief comments on that.
I'll just make a very brief comment. I don't think there's any threat right now for genocide in Macedonia. I think that's vastly overstated. I think Macedonians are going to be free to pursue their language, their culture, their history. And in fact, I think they'll be more free to do so under this agreement than perhaps in the past. But as I said, I think there's a lot of scaremongering that goes on. And frankly, I think this is some of it. You're entitled to your opinion, and
I would just say here, as soon as this topic came up on the agenda, the Congress was interested whether Macedonian service should change the name, if it changed. But in the agreement, it says that Macedonian language is staying intact. So it's not a question of losing the identity. The citizens will be citizens of North Macedonia, but they will speak Macedonian. So nothing will essentially change except that we're going to gain more access.
Final statement, Lord Robertson.
Well, 300 years ago, the independent nation of Scotland decided to merge with England and created the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And 4 years ago, in a referendum, the people of Scotland decided that they would stay part of the United Kingdom. We didn't give up our identity. We didn't give up any of our culture. We didn't give up anything to do with being Scottish or continuing to be Scottish, where we have different and distinct education systems, local government systems, and we even have our own legislative parliament as well. So, talking about cultural genocide, I think, is a massive exaggeration, which I don't think helps in an argument here. There is an inevitability about compromise in history, where if you want to achieve things, you inevitably have to be involved in compromise. And this is obviously a compromise, which is necessary in order to take the next step forward and to allow people in Macedonia to pursue their own chances and their own opportunities within the structures that exist. And what I say to said about the veto by Russia, Russia doesn't have a veto on NATO membership. And that's important to emphasize. That is a decision that people in NATO would take, and as people in Macedonia take as well. So outside influences are of no concern there. Inside influences are what have prevented Macedonia taking its rightful place inside NATO and eventually inside the European Union. And now the opportunity is there for people in that generational decision that they've got to grab the opportunity, and I hope they take that opportunity.
I want to close just by saying the Atlantic Council has made an intentional effort to try to keep a spotlight on Macedonia, on Southeast Europe, because there's a lot more at stake. Sarah here has been helping to run our Balkans Forward effort because the issue is there's unfinished business in Southeastern Europe. And we want to be able to help play the right role in helping the region reform, reconcile, and as we've watched throughout the history of our alliance, former adversaries become allies. It's also why we put quite a bit more energy in Greece recently. The Atlantic Council had a team in Athens meeting with all political forces on this set of issues this summer because we understand some of the heavy lifting that will be required there. But the bigger, more strategic issue as the Atlantic Council thinks about it is we're moving into a 21st century in which it's clear that the free world is facing a pretty serious challenge from an alternative model of authoritarian capitalist kleptocracies. And we're doing a lot of fighting within the family. And we have to figure out how to actually get our family aligned to understand the real challenges that we're going to be facing. And so part of that is resolving the unfinished business in a place like Macedonia, in a place like Southeastern Europe is crucial for us having that overall strategy right. I want to thank Lord Robertson for coming straight off a plane to join us, for Lilith and Mike for being with us, and for all of our guests to join us on a Monday evening to spotlight Macedonia and its future and how we can support it going forward. So thank you. Please join me in thanking them very much.